They were 18, or 19, or 20 years old. Sailors in a tropical paradise. They didn't know that on the other side of the ocean, another group of young men was preparing to strike them while they slept. Their paths would cross for a few short hours on a Sunday morning in December. And in one terrifying instant, more than 1,000 of them would die. The legacy of what happened on December the 7th, 1941, still haunts us today. In the first images from inside the USS Arizona, an underwater cemetery that's also an ecological time bomb. In the search for a top-secret Japanese submarine that was sunk about an hour before the attack began.
The submarine's heading north, starting to dive.
And in the quest to learn what really happened that day. And most of all, it still lives on in the memories of the men who were there when everything changed.
Just a young kid when this happened. And I've lived through it. I lost a lot of my friends.
I reached down to try to help him. I scared to get all came off.
But I hope it never happens again. Nobody will ever know what it was like, except somebody that was actually there.
They never had a chance. They didn't know what was coming. Nobody knew about it. They never woke up.
This is the story of a day when the history of the world took an unexpected turn at a sleepy little port in Hawaii called Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, in the first summer of the new millennium. 60 years ago on this island, a battle was fought, perhaps the most one-sided battle in American history. It plunged the United States into war and, in the space of little more than 2 hours, took the lives of 2,400 Americans. Ever since that day, Pearl Harbor has been a place of pilgrimage. Many of the men who lived through the attack have returned at least once to remember what happened and to pay their respects to friends who didn't make it.
We remember December 7th, 1941, when so many gave the last devotion of their efforts.
Well, it was kind of hard, yes, I'll admit it, because I couldn't do anything that the other guys could. I was only 5'3" and weighed 125 pounds. My battle station was a number 2 loader on a 5-inch gun, and I couldn't even pick up the shells that had to be put in the gun.
How can this ever happen? One of the strongest navies in the world, and we're sitting here with our pants down. We got caught, period.
It was one of the best assignments in the Navy. A sailor joining the Pacific Fleet in Hawaii could expect warm air, lots of sunshine, and plenty of things to do on shore leave. In the Atlantic theater of war, things were different. Europe had been at war for more than 2 years. Hitler's soldiers occupied Paris. London was being blitzed by Nazi bombs. For sailors stationed in the Pacific, there was only one threat on the horizon. Yet most Americans knew next to nothing about the country or its people, who were thought to be short and nearsighted. Quaint little people ruled by an old-fashioned emperor. In reality, Japan was a modern military power that had signed a pact with Nazi Germany. Japanese troops brutally occupied parts of China and were poised to move against other neighbors. But the United States Pacific Fleet stood in the way. And early in 1941, the Japanese military decided to do something about that.
Why would Japan want to go to war with the United States? What Japan wanted was the oil fields in the Dutch East Indies. What they wanted was the tin and the rubber out of Malaya. They wanted the Philippines because of its strategic location. Nobody thought that they would ever come out to Pearl Harbor. That's how you achieve surprise in war. You attack where nobody expects it.
It was the brainchild of a 57-year-old Japanese admiral named Isoroku Yamamoto. Yamamoto decided to strike the US fleet at its home base, at anchor in the cramped, shallow harbor near Honolulu.
For Yamamoto, he had studied in the United States. He had gone to Harvard. He knew what the Americans were like. And he said at one point, I don't care if we march troops down Pennsylvania Avenue, we're not going to conquer the United States. He planned the attack with the idea that if we're going to have any chance of winning this war, we've got to destroy the American fleet. And that'll give us 6 months to run wild in the Southwest Pacific. And we can build up a defensive barrier that will be very difficult for the Americans to crack. And at some point, they're going to say, we quit. You keep your gains.
In the spring of 1941, planning for the attack began in earnest, although only a handful of Japanese officers knew about it. A talented pilot named Minoru Genda was given the task of figuring out how to inflict maximum damage on the American fleet, especially its battleships and carriers, in a surprise attack from the air. Genda decided that a combination of bombs and torpedoes modified to operate in shallow waters would have the best chance of success. Late that summer and into the autumn, Japanese pilots trained for their top-secret mission. They rehearsed the low-altitude attack angles they would need over the harbor. They practiced strafing runs over and over. By the autumn, Yamamoto's plan had evolved into a mammoth undertaking that would require 6 aircraft carriers, more than 350 airplanes, and, almost as an afterthought, 5 midget submarines. Those 5 midget submarines played a curious and little-known part in the attack, and an expedition is getting underway in Honolulu to learn more. One of the tiny subs almost cost Japan the critical element of surprise.
And there's only 2 outliers. Target
And
32,
that's the one undersea
target
explorer
16
Robert Ballard is hoping to find.
to the east.
For the man who
And all
found
of
the
a sudden,
Titanic
he's
and the
attacked.
Bismarck, this search represents a
Right in
unique
this neck of
challenge.
the woods.
It's one of the smallest ships
target.
Ballard's ever looked for, and no one really knows where it sank.
How are you? Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. So, welcome aboard.
Joining him will be a man who was part of the
Jello will be
submarine
leaving
task
in a few
force
minutes.
6 decades ago, Kichiji Dewa.
Right. And then we'll be going...
The midget submarine they'll be looking for was sunk by an American destroyer well before the attack started, and could have alerted the American forces, but did not.
Here, so, gentlemen, I'd like to introduce some colleagues here.
Good morning, sir.
Will Lehner and Russ Reitz were there when it happened.
Glad that we can be friends. Glad that we can be friends.
For Ballard, the expedition offers an opportunity to clear up a common misconception.
Well, I think most people think that the first shot was fired by the Japanese as they swooped over the Pali and descended on our sleeping fleet that Sunday morning. But in fact, the first shot was fired out here, and it was fired by a U.S. destroyer.
Not only was it the first shots fired by America in the war, it should have alerted us to that something was going on. I find it incredibly ironic that the attack and sinking of this Japanese submarine an hour before the planes arrived did not alert us. And I just find that to be amazing.
Ballard's tight schedule only allows him 2 weeks for the mission, sponsored by National Geographic. But the search area isn't too large, and he does have the right equipment. Now, all he needs is a little luck.
We got to get it out.
November 26, 1941. The Japanese armada slipped out of port and headed east through wintry seas. 6 carriers were grouped at the center of the formation, surrounded by a protective ring of cruisers, battleships, and destroyers, some 30 ships in all. Because the success of the mission rested on taking the Americans totally by surprise, their route would take them well north of commercial shipping lanes. If another ship spotted them, the mission would be in jeopardy and possibly called off. Strict radio silence was maintained at all times as the attack force moved into position, while far to the south, 5 Japanese submarines were already closing in on the island of Oahu. Each mother sub, as it was called, carried 1 midget submarine lashed to its afterdeck. Together, they made up the most controversial element of the strike force.
The Japanese wanted to put everything that they had into this attack, and they had midget submarines. And so let's use them, was Yamamoto's decision. Now, there were people in the Japanese high command that objected strongly to that. Don't bring submarines into Pearl Harbor. In the first place, they're not going to get in. In the second place, they're not going to do much damage if they do. And in the third place, and by far more important, that's going to tip off the Americans that an attack is coming, and it's going to put the Americans up in general quarters all across Pearl Harbor and all across Hawaii. So don't use them.
But they did use them. Each midget sub would carry a 2-man crew into battle, 10 hand-picked, highly trained young men who were prepared to die for their country. On the night before the attack, they would penetrate Pearl Harbor, wait on the bottom for the planes to strike, then fire their 2 torpedoes at any large ship in their range. If circumstances permitted, they would try to leave the harbor and rendezvous with the mother subs. But no one really expected the submariners to return.
They were young, they were enthusiastic, they were courageous, they were ready to go out and die for the emperor, and it was a suicide mission. Nobody said that quite that way, but that's what it was, a suicide mission. And these guys were eager for it.
当時の我々の気持ちとしてはですね、悲壮な感じいうのはありませんね。 There was no sense of impending tragedy. Everyone felt that we were simply carrying out our duty by taking part in military action, though I felt that they might never make it back.
Day one of the search, about 2 miles outside the narrow channel that leads into Pearl Harbor. It was here, somewhere, that a destroyer called the USS Ward was patrolling in the early hours of December the 7th, 1941.
I was thinking that we were a little more that way, but Russ says no, we were more this way.
Yeah.
But we were.
Well, then you average those two, right?
It's the history that tells you what you need to know. And so you have to steep yourself in history, and you have to read all sorts of sources, because a lot of history is conflicting. One book will say one thing, one book will say another thing, and so you have to find out, well, what do we all agree upon, and where is the uncertainty? Here the uncertainty was, where were they exactly when the attack took place?
Coming in from another direction. And all of the historical databases. Well, you know, after the war, and in fact during the war, this became a dumping site. And our biggest fear is that they dump something right on top of what we're looking for. So basically what you have down here is a museum of World War II. We don't know what the currents are going to be like. We don't know what the visibility is going to be like. We don't know how the ship's going to perform. So today is a big learning curve. Day one of our expedition.
Ballard decides the work will go faster if he adds another machine to the mix, a remotely operated vehicle called Little Herc.
Well, it's an imaging ROV. It moves very rapidly. We can cover a lot of ground quick and see a lot of targets quick. So it's just a good way to go.
Little Herc is tethered behind a bulkier imaging system called Argus, and the two vehicles descend to 600 feet. In the control room, the team gets its first glimpse of the sea floor.
There's what's this coming up? The cylinder. Is that a torpedo? No. Piece of pipe.
This is really exciting. Every little thing looks like part of it.
Well, it looks like it. These are depth charges. There's a whole bunch of them. There's another one.
As the first few days of the search come to an end, they've seen a lot of debris and not much else. Saturday night, December the 6th, 1941. Sailors on shore leave filled the bars on Hotel Street in Honolulu. The usual Saturday night crowd gathered for dinner and dancing. At Hickam Field, the airplanes were parked wingtip to wingtip. And in the harbor, the warships of the Pacific Fleet prepared for the night. California, Oklahoma, Maryland, Tennessee, West Virginia, Arizona, Nevada. The last day of peace in the United States was coming to an end. December the 7th, 1941, a few minutes after midnight. 10 miles away from the mouth of Pearl Harbor, the 5 mother submarines prepared to launch the midgets. The Japanese crews could see the lights on Waikiki and make out strains of jazz when the wind shifted. Each of the submariners wrote a letter to his parents. Sadamu Kamida was a quiet mountain boy who loved baseball.
Forgive this negligent son for not writing these long months. We are soon to be dispatched to regions unknown. Should anything happen to me, do not grieve or mourn. Should I fail to write, do not be alarmed. For it means I am well, and discharging my duties faithfully. Goodbye.
クルーを出港する前の晩にですね、
The night before they left, Commander Yokoyama, his crewman Kamida, and I went to the officers' mess that normally enlisted men couldn't enter. We ate a farewell dinner. Later, there was a small party in the officers' wardroom.
Dewa watched his friends enter the midget sub and spoke to Yokoyama one last time over a phone link.
まあ出ていく人に対
I
しては
said something like, take care to them. I didn't say anything special, just words of parting said on the phone, very normal. Even though the fact that they wouldn't return was a foregone conclusion, we didn't talk about it.
The midget carried by Dewa's submarine was the first to leave, released into the water around 1 a.m. By 3 a.m., all the midgets were making their way toward the harbor, except the one skippered by Ensign Sakamaki. He was having trouble with his gyroscope. Without it, he'd have to take his bearings on the surface and risk being spotted by an American ship.
You're sneaking into a harbor and you don't want to trip the alarm and let the Americans know that the war has begun. And so you must be extremely nervous. You've got to be just on pins and needles.
And then, the first missed opportunity for the Americans. At 3:42 a.m., an officer on board the minesweeper Condor spotted a periscope in the water 50 yards off the port bow. Condor alerted the ward, patrolling the approaches to Pearl Harbor.
Remember about 3:30 or so, the skipper called general quarters about 3:20, 3:30. I don't remember the exact time, but remember that?
I remember that.
And we thought, what kind of a skipper is this? He just came aboard, and now we got general quarters, and he's going to start drilling us. And we thought,
it was just a drill.
That skipper is going to be a tough one to live with. But he was one of the best skippers we ever had, remember?
But the ward's new skipper misunderstood the message and went to look in the wrong place. The one thing Japanese planners feared most had occurred. 4 hours before the attack, one of their ships had been spotted. And nothing happened. Sunday, December the 7th, around dawn. Aboard the 6 aircraft carriers, the pilots and planes of the first wave began to assemble. Yamamoto's plan called for 2 distinct waves of attack. The first to reach Honolulu about 8 a.m., the second to follow within the hour. It meant getting the right aircraft into the air at the right time. Each wave would take about 15 minutes to launch. The first to go were 43 Mitsubishi fighters armed with machine guns and cannon, the dreaded Zeros. Then 49 Nakajima bombers, Kates, each carrying a single 1,760-pound armor-piercing bomb. 51 Aichi dive bombers were next to leave, the Vals. And finally, another 40 Kates carrying specially modified torpedoes. At about 6:20 a.m., the planes formed up and headed south. At almost the same time as the first wave turned toward Oahu, the US Navy got its second report of intruders near the harbor. At 6:30 a.m., a lookout on the freighter Antares spotted another submarine periscope, then a conning tower. Once again, the Ward raced to investigate. And this time, the destroyer found what she was looking for.
The submarine started to surface, and I'm midships right at the rail. And when I see this thing start to surface, I thought, wow, what's this?
Then the skipper took after this submarine. And of course, we didn't know it at the time, but later on, he told us that his first thought was ramming it. But he said, this is my first ship, and I don't want to ruin it.
And all of a sudden, number 1 gun fired, and they missed because their elevation wasn't great enough. We were that close. And then number 3 gun fired, and I saw the splash, the water line of the conning tower as the shell hit the conning tower.
It must have rang like a bell. I mean, just must have been an incredible explosion that went off right next to their head. I mean, remember, the skipper is standing in the conning tower and the shell hit the conning tower. You would think he must have died instantly. Or did he? Because they then began to dive, so clearly they weren't dead. And they then began to dive, and no sooner did they dive than the depth charges are going off.
Exploded, and I didn't see the submarine as it came up, but I'm told that it came up, rolled over, and then went back down again.
After the depth charges that we dropped, I can't see any way it could have gotten away from us.
At 6:51 a.m., Skipper William Outerbridge of the Ward radioed headquarters that he had seen and fired upon an unidentified submarine. He repeated the message 2 minutes later. At headquarters, the Ward's terse report slowly worked its way up the chain of command. For the second time that morning, the Japanese had tripped the alarm. And for the second time, nothing happened. Day 10 of Ballard's search, and still no sign of what they're looking for.
And that was in here.
The submarine was coming this way, and we were coming this way.
Why was this one on the surface?
Maybe he's not sure, but maybe the passenger in the small submarine, they are looking, and then they make sure the position.
So far, Ballard has covered about 2 square miles of seabed in an area called the Flats, where the Ward was patrolling. So far, they've seen a lot of debris, but the missing sub has eluded them. Each time they pick up a promising target on sonar, it turns out to be something else. A crumpled seaplane used by the Navy in the late 20s and 30s. A Grumman Hellcat fighter. Then, part of a similar type of midget sub, captured later in the war and then dumped. And finally, something that seems to have treads.
You think so? Yeah, it's a tank. It's a tracked vehicle. Well, let's work it over. Yeah, look.
Another day's search is coming to an end without results.
Exhausted all our targets.
Yep. There's nothing left to look at. All right, well, The only thing left is the base of the wall, and that the sub does. So let's call it a wrap and pull it up, okay? Out of the pool.
That's good. Not out in the flats, so
very good.
The only place left is up against the wall.
Yeah. Yep.
So tomorrow we'll come out with the 2 subs and take it right in next to the channel and look at the base of the wall, which we couldn't do with these vehicles.
Good.
They've used up most of their allotted 2 weeks with nothing to show for it. For Bob Ballard and his team, time is running out. December the 7th, 1941, 7 a.m. A mobile radar station on the northwest coast of Oahu picked up the signal of a massive number of aircraft approaching the island from the north. They were less than 140 miles away, moving at 180 miles an hour. A telephone call went immediately to the information center in Honolulu, 40 miles to the southeast. The call was routed to a private named MacDonald, who passed it on to a Lieutenant Tyler, who had just been assigned to the job. Tyler told the radar operators not to worry about it. In his mind, it was just a squadron of American B-17s due in from the mainland. For the 3rd time that day, the Japanese had tripped the alarm, and for the 3rd time, no one seemed to notice. It was 7:15 a.m. At 7:40 a.m., the first wave of airplanes reached the coast of Oahu, guided by the signal from a Honolulu radio station. The bombers and torpedo planes were at 9,000 feet. 5,000 feet above them, the Zeros flew cover. The first wave began to break up into their attack formations. One to fly inland towards Wheeler Airfield. The other to move down the western coast to Pearl Harbor. They were the only planes in the sky. There was no sign whatsoever that the Americans knew they were about to be attacked. At 7:50 a.m., the first wave reached Pearl Harbor. Among their first targets, Hickam Airfield and the Naval Air Base on Ford Island. Clarence Miner was an airman stationed on Ford Island.
After all that noise on the tin roof up there and stuff were popping around, I looked up and I saw this airplane come diving down and that big meatball, and I said, oh shit. And then all hell all over the place was breaking loose. Bombs dropping, machine gun fire. And like I said, the things are so darn low you can throw rocks at them.
Ralph Lindenmeyer was also on Ford Island.
7:55 in the morning, an explosion woke us up. I looked up at the clock when I first heard the explosion and felt it, and I said, the Japs are here. And when I looked out the window, the plane came over and it had saw the meatball on the fuselage and the wings, and I could look into the pilot's face and I could almost see him grinning.
Anchored on Pier 1010 was the utility vessel Argon, where 19-year-old Charles Christensen worked in the machine shop.
I thought, oh, that was a bad explosion. I wonder what happened. and I opened the porthole up, and I stuck my head right on out there, you know, and oh boy, was there ever a fire on Ford Island. I thought, oh my goodness, something is really bad blowing up over there.
It took a while for sailors in the ships at anchor to comprehend what was happening. Bert Davis, a machinist's mate on the USS Selfridge, thought it was some kind of readiness drill.
That's where I was standing when the plane came in. I was standing there shining my shoes. And I saw these planes coming in. Came right straight across where the Raleigh was. And I thought to myself, what in the hell is the Army doing holding maneuvers on a day like this?
While the dive bombers hammered the airfields, the torpedo planes descended to an altitude of a few dozen feet and took dead aim at Battleship Row. Aboard the Argonne, Charles Christensen had a perfect view of the first torpedo run.
He's coming in almost straight across me at a slight angle across, and he's low enough that he's maybe 30 feet off of the water, which puts him maybe eye level or a little more from me, and I can see the man's face. He's got his helmet on, he's got his goggles on, and he's looking over the side, and when he straightened that plane out, leveled it out, he dropped that torpedo, and I thought, oh my God, look at that. And that torpedo just went as straight for the Oklahoma as it could go.
This photo, taken from a Japanese plane, shows Battleship Row just after the attack began. The ripples emanating outward are the result of multiple torpedo strikes. George Smith was below deck on the battleship Oklahoma when general quarters sounded.
Then all of a sudden the guy come over to the loudspeaker, this is no shit, move it. And then we got a torpedo. I was really so scared I didn't know what the hell was going on.
The Oklahoma started to capsize almost immediately.
When they said abandoned ship, the only way we could get out was through the Kingsman window. We went out there and the ship was rolling on top of us. Maybe we jumped about 5 feet into the water, which wasn't far. But when you turn around and see this thing coming on top of you, you swim for all you can swim and as fast as you can swim. Because we know we had to get around the big gun turrets. They were coming over next on us.
It went over so fast, I just was sure, I didn't know, but I was sure they were trapped inside of that because it just rolled right on over, and there it was, keel up.
George Smith had just been released from the Oklahoma's brig for going ashore without leave, and it saved his life.
And when the ship got the torpedo, the brig was in the carpenter shop on board ship. And when the torpedo hit, it broke the carpenter's workbench loose, pinned the guard against the wall, the bulkhead, and he couldn't release the other men that were in the brig, and they all drowned.
On the far side of Ford Island, the old battleship Utah also got hit a few minutes before 8. Clark Simmons worked on the Utah as a mess attendant.
And as I looked out the port, I saw a plane making a run on the Utah. And as she dropped the torpedo, the wing dipped, and then he straightened up, and the torpedo hit it, and another one right behind it did the same thing. And we knew that it was just a matter of time before the ship was going to sink. And actually it took 8 minutes. In 8 minutes, the ship was history. She had turned turtle in 8 minutes. As the lines began to part, came over the side and began to swim toward Fort Island. And as we were swimming, they were machine gunning us from both directions, from this direction, and when they came from Pearl City over here, from that direction also. I I saw fellas yelling and screaming. Some of the fellas in the water was asking for help. It was so chaotic. I really didn't know what was going on.
But the biggest blow was yet to come. Lying inboard of the repair ship Vestal was the battleship Arizona. High overhead, a Kate released an armor-piercing bomb that drifted down towards the Arizona's No. 2 gun turret. It was 10 minutes after 8. A film camera captured the moment of impact. In that instant, more than 1,000 crewmen died. Stu Headley was on the West Virginia, a few hundred feet away.
One gigantic explosion. Now, when we fired the 16-inch, you're inside, it sounds like thunder up in the distance. But this didn't sound like no thunder. This was one gigantic explosion. The stern of our ship lifted out of the water, but at the same time we were getting hit with torpedoes, we were starting to list. But we saw about 32 men flying through the air from the Arizona.
Oil from the fully fueled Arizona began to spread and catch fire. The heat was so intense, even sailors on nearby ships were threatened.
So Crosland and I stripped right down to our undershorts and jumped in and swam underwater. Now, we're not underwater swimmers, but we swam underwater that day because that was the hottest breath of air we ever breathed, because that was the oil from the Arizona that was ablaze.
The bomb had penetrated Arizona's forward magazine and ignited more than 1 million pounds of gunpowder. Those who were still alive found themselves in an inferno.
They were in this oil that was on fire. They were trying to swim out of it. They'd come up and trying to get their breath. Their eyes, the white of their eyes was just as red as they can be. I can just see it today. The skin on their face was just falling off. And on top of that, all of this oil, and they were just drenched in oil.
Bert Davis went out in a whaleboat to pick up survivors.
Oh, God, it was horrible. Just one fella started to reach up to try to get a hold of the gunnel on the boat from the outside, and I reached down to try to help him, and I took him by the arm, and as I tried to lift like that, the skin all came off. He was dead by the time we got him in.
"35 minutes after the attack began, the first wave flew away, leaving behind more than 1,000 dead American sailors, many of them teenagers, caught below decks when Arizona exploded and sank. Six decades after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Arizona still lies where she sank with her cargo of sailors. Most of their bodies have never been recovered. Her superstructure was removed during the war. Only the mount of her No. 3 turret remains above water. The Arizona was built nearly a century ago, and she spent more than half that time underwater. The National Park Service, which is responsible for maintaining the memorial, periodically checks on her condition. Her passageways and hatches, her 14-inch guns, the interior of the ship is too dangerous for divers, so it's never been investigated by the Park Service, until now. With the help of a tiny ROV made available by National Geographic, workers will get their first glimpse of Arizona's condition deep inside the ship since about the time she went down. The initial survey reveals that the corrosion is worse than expected. And that may portend an ecological disaster because of something happening deep inside the ship. The Arizona has been leaking an estimated 2 pints of oil a day ever since she sank. But the Park Service is worried that the remaining fuel tanks, the ship's bunkers, could rupture at any moment.
Current estimates are that there's approximately 500,000 gallons, possibly in the bunkers on the aft section of the ship. And so with current technology,